In this lecture, I'd like to review the concept of Enlightened Absolutism and what it was precisely about the Enlightenment that influenced the monarchs of 18th century Europe in shifting their states a little, making them a bit more efficient, but basically responding to the concerns and criticisms of the Enlightenment philosophers and how successful they were, or unsuccessful they were, in really prompting a change to state government in the 18th century. Even as Louis's reign was influential on monarchs of the 17th and early 18th centuries, so too were ideas of the early Enlightenment that was just beginning to take hold. And as those ideas took hold, absolutist monarchs did try to incorporate them in various ways in their governing. The philosophers believed that the success of the state depended on the degree of freedom and happiness that the state was able to assure its people. David Hume had claimed that a state was justified by the good that is done in its name. Voltaire and Diderot were both proponents of what they called enlightened despotism. Rousseau, in A Foretaste of Things to Come, had claimed that absolutism and Enlightenment thinking were incompatible, though, and we see a mixture of all of these ideas in the reigns of the monarchs that we're going to focus on today. Some thinkers of the Enlightenment age were particularly influential in the creation of enlightened statescraft, and I want to go over three of those at the moment. Cesare Monasanto, who was the Marquis of Beccaria, was a Milanese noble. He became a professor of political philosophy, and he ended his career advising the state chancellery of Habsburg, Austria. He is best known, however, for his ideas on crime and punishment. His book of the same name argued that the state's task was to protect society while respecting the dignity of its people. This meant that the rights of those accused of crimes also had to be protected. This was a really remarkable and revolutionary idea. Beccaria suggested standard procedures which should govern criminal trials so that both rich and poor defendants would stand equally before the law. He believed that the accused should be considered innocent until they were proven guilty, and he also pushed the concept of a trial by jury. Beccaria argued that the punishment for a given crime should not be linked to the religious concept of sin, but rather be rationally determined by an assessment of the damage the crime had done to humanity. In this way, he believed, you reject the death penalty except in cases where the state itself is threatened by anarchy. His philosophy could be summarized by one sentence: it is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. His principles are ultimately seen as reflecting the origins of utilitarianism. We'll study that next semester. This is going to be a very influential social theory of the first decades of the 19th century. Monasanto also argues that the barbarous punishments, especially those common at the time, really only encouraged disrespect for the law and for society, hence they lead to more awful crimes. So he urged leaders to disregard torture as an effective means of preventing crime. He was, as you might imagine, only moderately successful in his aims. Charles-Louis de Secondat, who was the Baron de Montesquieu, studied law, and after moving to Paris in 1721, he focuses first on a critique of government and society, and he publishes the Persian Letters. In this form of reports that were sent home by two Persian villagers to the West, it details political and social injustices of life in the West. The work offers the first critical examination of slavery done by a philosopher. He argues in the Persian Letters that slavery was against natural law because all men are born free and independent. His interest in the, we might say, hypocrisy of society and government leads him to write The Spirit of the Laws, which is published in 1748. This described the relationship between climate, religion, and tradition, and the historical evolution of a nation's political life. So it was a very grand work in scope. He argued that laws were subject to critical inquiry and historical study because they developed over time. So they should be changed. They evolved, they progressed, or should, as society did. He was very impressed by the comparison of the English Parliament and the French Parlement. He pointed out that each political system and legal tradition evolved differently, and this could be seen in the makeup and the role of the legal institutions for each. He was very admiring of the English Parliament, which was a representative parliament in nature. He saw it as an intermediate power that could prevent the creation of monarchical despotism or a republic. And it should be clear that Montesquieu did not like republics. He felt that republics really were chaotic and did not do anything and could not move toward a common goal. He feared that the French monarchy showed signs of becoming despotic because the French government lacked the separation of powers that he could see in England's government. He argued then that only constitutionalism could combine the guarantee for order with those of freedom. He argued that the sovereignty of the king came not from God, but from the people, echoing the sentiments of John Locke. As you might imagine, his spirit of the laws wasn't terribly popular in French political circles. The third of these philosophers who had an impact is Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a Scottish professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow, and it's Adam Smith who begins to argue against mercantilism, this grand financial economic policy that, of course, Colbert, Louis's finance minister, put in place. Adam Smith argued that such nitpicky control over the government actually hampered economic growth. He opposed guild restrictions and other monopolies, as well as trade barriers and other forms of protectionism. He advocated instead the free market, believing that the tension between suppliers and demanders would, of its own accord, lead to market equilibrium. Those of you who are already taking economics or have taken it will understand what I mean here. He believed that if you just let the economy run on its own, let people who supply products determine what they're going to supply and at what price, and let people who are going to purchase these products decide whether or not they like them, and if they do like them, at which price they're willing to purchase them. If you just let that work unobtrusively on its own, that eventually suppliers and demanders will come to an equilibrium price at an equilibrium supply amount. And that in this way, the economy could be allowed to grow without government intervention. Smith then argued for laissez-faire in economics, the allowance of the invisible hand of the economy, this tension between supply and demand. These are the concepts that form classical economics, and these are what he elaborated on in his great work, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. Let's begin our look at enlightened despots by studying the reign of Frederick II the Great of Prussia. It's important, I think, to look at his childhood because it did shape him a bit. Frederick and his father, Frederick William, were not close at all. The latter did not understand the former's love of learning and his seeming disregard for all things military. So Frederick spent much of his childhood alone, not even seeking his father's approval. He studied, apparently in secret. His father insisted that his education be secular and religious, but Frederick was able to persuade his tutor to ensure that he studied the classics, that he studied music. Frederick was apparently a very accomplished flautist, and he made friends. Just because he didn't like the military doesn't mean that he didn't have friends who were in the military. So he grew up kind of poor little rich kid. At some point in his teenage years, Frederick apparently tried to flee his father's authority. It seemed that his thought was to escape to England, because in England, his maternal uncle, who happened to be King George II, was likely to give him a place to stay, a place where he could continue his studies, and maybe importantly, a place from where Frederick could look at deposing his father, eventually. Frederick attempted to leave with a contingent of junior officers from the Prussian army. This group included a very close friend of his, who was about 8 years his senior, Lieutenant Hans von Katte. Frederick William, however, caught wind of the plan, and he caught up to them before they were really able to leave Prussia. Furious, the king intended to have his son executed for treason. He was not going to stand for such a blatant disregard of his authority. The king's officials persuaded him not to have his son executed, but Frederick William still wanted to punish his son in a significant way. As a result of that, Frederick William chose to force his son to watch the execution of his close friend, von Katte. There are some historians who claim that von Katte and Frederick were lovers. So this moment in time where Frederick is forced to view the execution of whether it was his best friend or his lover doesn't really matter, it was traumatic, seems to have changed Frederick in some fundamental ways. Thereafter, he was forced to work for the royal bureaucracy and forced to rise through the ranks in the army. We don't know if Frederick became hardened by the experience or whether he just decided to stop fighting his dad. We know that he didn't love his father, or at least didn't evince much love for his father, but he adopted that brusque, absolutist tendency that his father had. But by the time he ascended to the throne in 1740, his dedication to the state of Prussia and his fame was such that he was already called the Great by his subjects. So this was an earned title, not one that was given to him later. Frederick wanted to be remembered as an enlightened ruler. Remember, he was very well educated. He turned his court into a center of learning for the nobility, and like other enlightened rulers, he felt that French was the language of learning and insisted upon its use in court. He viewed himself as a philosopher king and engaged the nobles in discussions about Enlightenment philosophy and ideas. Frederick hosted Voltaire in Prussia. He and Voltaire had been friends even before he ascended the throne, and Voltaire lauded him as the man who had transformed, quote, a sad Sparta into a brilliant Athens, end quote. Their friendship, though, is going to fracture when Voltaire criticizes a dynastic move that Frederick makes. In 1740, Frederick responds by increasingly censoring his friend, and Voltaire is going to leave Prussia for good in 1752. So even in the very beginning, you start to see that friction between the absolutist tendencies and the enlightened appeal. In some of his actions, though, we can see that Frederick was clearly enlightened. He freed all the serfs on royal domains. He ordered the abolition of a serf's tithes to noble lands, and he also abolished the lord's right to punish his serfs physically. He enacted judicial reforms, which limited the rulings of judges, which could be arbitrary at the time. And, Voltaire notwithstanding, Frederick relaxes censorship, and he abolishes capital punishment, except in the army. Frederick also begins work on the Prussian Code, which won't be completed until 1794, so quite a few years after his death, but which will ultimately grant, quote, every inhabitant of the state complete freedom of religion and conscience. So there are certainly elements of tolerance that we can see in the reforms that Frederick makes in Prussia. Of course, we also know that Frederick's reforms were meant to make Prussia more powerful. While there was more social mobility than ever before, this is because Frederick needed university-trained bureaucrats to serve in his government and to make it more efficient. Frederick improved the bureaucracy by introducing an examination system. This was similar to the much older concept that the Chinese had instituted, the Chinese civil service exam. Your performance on these exams determined which individuals were able to enter the bureaucracy and where in the bureaucracy these individuals were able to enter. The most extensive set of exams was for entry into the judiciary, and it was here in the judiciary that commoners most frequently rose through the ranks. In Berlin during this time, only a third of the judges were nobles, so that's an incredible feat for the 18th century. The Prussian Code reinforced a tripartite view of society. An individual was either a member of the nobility, the bourgeoisie, or the common estate. To subsidize the expense of landowning and to ensure that most Prussian land remained in the hands of the nobility, Frederick created institutions that provided credit to nobles facing financial difficulties. This was an important solution because nobles were not permitted to sell their land to non-nobles. Again, he wanted to make sure that land stayed in the hands of the nobility. Frederick also refused to promote civilian bureaucrats into the nobility, but he refused to ban serfdom on private estates. So there was a tolerance on some level and actually a tightening of restrictions on others. If we look back and see that he had freed serfs, on his own lands, it seems that his generosity in freeing his serfs was simply because he needed to increase the number of soldiers in his army, and using his own former serfs to do so was a very convenient way to see that increase in numbers. So while Frederick was able to enact very significant reforms for Prussia, these reforms were a mixed bag. Some elements of Enlightenment tolerance, other elements of continued absolutism. The end result is going to be, though, an increased Prussian state. If we look here on this map, everything that you see in the lighter purple is basically the result of Frederick II's either extension of his father's extension or consolidation of power. We're going to talk about a couple of ways that he did that here in just a little bit. We come here to the first of two women we're going to look at as an enlightened despot. Maria Teresa of the Holy Roman Empire isn't normally seen as an enlightened despot, and yet I wanted to include her here because her reign is incredibly significant to 18th century politics in Europe. From the beginning, her ascension to the throne of Austria was unique. She was, after all, a woman. It was a curious happenstance. Her father, who was Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, married her mother in 1708. He became Holy Roman Emperor in 1711 when his older brother died. At that time, in 1711, Charles is the sole surviving male member of the House of Habsburg, and he's incredibly nervous about the succession, in particular, to ensure that his own children will ascend to the throne before the daughters of his brother, his nieces. In 1713, then, Charles VI issues the Pragmatic Sanction. Pragmatic Sanction assures that his daughters inherit the throne ahead of his nieces. He doesn't have to do one for his sons, because if he has sons, they will inherit. But he wants to make sure that if he has daughters and daughters only, they will get to inherit the throne. This was prescient. His first daughter isn't born until 1717. So he issues the Pragmatic Sanction before he even has children. He does have a son with his wife, but that son dies 7 months after birth. And so his oldest daughter, who is Maria Teresa, ends up being the focus for all of this succession concern. Charles is going to work tirelessly from Maria Teresa's birth until his death in 1740 to ensure that Europe's great monarchies recognize her right to the throne. It was important to do because, as it turns out, he and his wife will have 2 more daughters and no more sons. So those daughters are the last of the House of Habsburg. While Maria Teresa could assume the throne of her patrimony, she was barred from becoming Holy Roman Empress. That was just a way that the traditional role of the Holy Roman Emperor was written. But the fact that she could not become Holy Roman Empress meant that the primacy of the Habsburg dynasty itself was threatened. So when she was still quite young, her father sought to ensure his daughter's rights through political marriage. Who could he marry her off to who would be a good, loyal Holy Roman Emperor to the Habsburg family? Francis of Lorraine will eventually become Maria Teresa's husband, but her father kind of goes through this whole episode of interviewing possible candidates for her hand in marriage. He considers Charles of Spain, in fact, even has an engagement between his daughter and Charles of Spain for a brief period. He even considers Frederick of Prussia as a possible suitor. The only thing that stops him is that Frederick is Calvinist, and of course the Habsburgs are Catholic. By the time her father dies, in 1740, Maria Teresa had been married for 4 years to Francis. But when she becomes Queen of Austria, some of the territory she controls nonetheless rebel, the most important being Bohemia, because they wanted a male heir on the throne. So the fact that she was married and had been married for a while, and in fact was pregnant at the time, again, didn't matter to them one bit. Incidentally, when her father died, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire select a Bavarian prince whose name was also Charles to become the next Holy Roman Emperor. He holds the throne until 1745 when he dies. At that point, Francis, Maria Teresa's husband, does become Holy Roman Emperor. So she is able to control the empire through her husband, which is significant. While Maria Teresa needed to deal with the uprising in Bohemia, she faces another crisis, and this is the fact that her lands are invaded by Frederick the Great of Prussia. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. While one might say that her gender would hamper Maria Teresa in very significant ways during her reign, at the same time, she nonetheless works to consolidate power. Seeing it as a necessity, she is going to make Francis co-ruler of Austria and Bohemia. Although he wasn't allowed to make any decisions of state, which is kind of funny. Initially, she relied on her father's advisors for help, but eventually she goes her own way. She is especially distraught over their counsel with the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, and that really leads her to find her own way, her own counselors. During the first 20 years of her reign, Maria Teresa was almost always pregnant. Over the course of 20 years, from 1737 to 1757, she gave birth 16 times. 13 of those children survived infancy. She arranged political marriages for each of her children, often going to great lengths to instruct them, especially her female children, in the politics and cultural values of their intended spouses. In 1770, when her youngest daughter's hand in marriage was unexpectedly sought by France, Maria Teresa drilled French court ritual and politics into her daughter until Maria Antonia, who will eventually be known as Marie Antoinette, left for France. She was a very solicitous mother, but she nonetheless believed she could dictate her children's actions from afar. We're told that she wrote to each of her children at least once a week. With Marie Antoinette, it was more bi-weekly, because she couldn't be trusted to write back more frequently than that. She reprimanded them for what she felt was unroyal activity and tried to get them to further Maria Teresa's own aims in their home territories. Maria Teresa was a devout Catholic. She was very conscious of threats to her throne, and her advisors counseled her about the power and influence of the Jesuits. As a result of that, she purged them from imperial offices, even going so far as to confiscate their lands during the later part of her reign. Religion was very important to her. Initially, she apparently had felt that she could simply convert all of her non-Catholic subjects. Eventually, she's going to give that up. She's going to realize that that's not possible. But she continues to view Protestants and Jews with distrust, and she persecutes them. At the beginning of her reign, she taxed Jewish subjects very heavily, and she had some Protestants forcibly moved from their territories in Austria to Transylvania. That was a pretty significant move there. She ends her Jewish persecution sometime in the early 1760s. Most historians believe it's because there is a Jewish suitor who really plays upon her sympathies, and she comes to see the benefits of Jewish businesses and banks to the Austrian Empire. But she's going to continue persecuting Protestants until about 1777. It's at that point that her son, Joseph, who at that point was already Holy Roman Emperor, threatens to abdicate the throne. He threatens to leave the throne of the Holy Roman Empire if she does not cease persecuting the Protestants. He viewed her persecutions of other religious minorities as incredibly unjust. So she finally stops her persecutions in 1777. Of course, this is only 3 years before her death. All that said, Maria Teresa still enacted multiple reforms in the Holy Roman Empire, many of which can be seen as Enlightenment reforms. For example, she sought to collect taxes from clergy and nobles, and she was moderately successful in doing so. This increased the amount of revenue that the Austrian treasury had, actually quite significantly. She established a council of state to advise her. So even though she saw herself as an absolutist monarch, she did have a close group of counselors that included members of the clergy, members of the military, and members of the bureaucracy to help her come to important decisions. She established a standing army of 108,000 troops. This was in direct response to the troubles at the beginning of her reign, and we'll look at that again more closely in a bit. She was very interested in medicine. She founded the Vienna General Hospital, and she gave them an important goal, which was to study and reduce infant mortality and smallpox infection. Austria is going to become one of the first nations to encourage smallpox inoculation. And there's a really charming story of Maria Teresa inviting a group of 65 children who had volunteered bravely to be inoculated against smallpox. She invites them to a dinner at Schönbrunn Palace there in Vienna, and she serves them herself, so as to showcase how importantly she viewed smallpox inoculations. In 1766, work was completed on the Codex Teresianus. This was a code which defined civil rights in Austria. So we see that Maria Teresa, like Frederick the Great, is working on legal codes, civil codes for her state. The Codex Teresianus outlawed such things as witch burnings and torture, although the latter is going to reappear later. She also institutes a new school system. It's based on the Prussian one in 1775, and this school system mandated that all Austrian children ages 6 to 12 of both genders attend school. She also allows non-Catholics to attend university. So she's very expansive in her outlook on certain things. When she dies in 1780, so too did the direct line of the House of Habsburg die. So even though her son and then her son's children will continue to rule, they, of course, claim more direct descendancy from their father's line, not her line. So she is the last official ruling Habsburg, of the Habsburg line. Let us look finally at Tsarina Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine is going to continue the work that Peter the Great had begun in Russia. She was not Russian herself. She was a German princess. Her name at birth was Sophia Augusta Frederica. She converts to Russian Orthodoxy and assumes a new name, Ekaterina Alexis, at the time of her engagement to the Grand Duke Peter, who will later become Tsar Peter III. But she was incredibly contemptuous of her adopted country's culture and language. She didn't even like to use German, despite her own German heritage. She institutes French as the official language of learning and of the court, and says publicly that she heeds Diderot's advice to her. She hosts Diderot at her court. Diderot had told her that to instruct a nation is to civilize it, and she believed very sincerely that what she wanted to do and what she needed to do in Russia was to civilize it. She began civilizing it, her educational enterprise, by establishing a school for the daughters of nobles and, without eliminating state censorship, by authorizing the first private printing presses, which thus encouraged the publication of more books and encouraged literacy by extension. She was influenced by Montesquieu, and she wanted the nobility to serve as an intermediary body between herself, between the crown, and her subjects. She hoped that by clarifying the rights of the nobility, the nobles might contribute more effectively to the functioning and the glory of her state. Her grand idea in this regard is the Charter of the Nobility, which was promulgated in 1785. This formalized the relationship between the nobility and the autocratic state of Russia. It recognized two types of nobility: the nobility of the blood, which were families who were of noble blood, and she said that the nobility of the blood was equal to the nobility of service. These were families who had become noble through service to the state. A noble's property, their right to hold serfs, their immunity from arrest, and immunity from the confiscation of property by the state was also affirmed. So they got something out of it as well. She just wanted to formalize this relationship, to create a true social contract between the crown and the nobles. However, despite Catherine's enlightenment, especially regarding the role of the state, various serf rebellions broke out, still in continued protest to the Code of 1649. In addition to these more class-based rebellions, there was another little protest that emerged. A pretender to the Russian throne who claimed to be Tsar Peter III, this man turned out to be Cossack Emelian Pugachev, led several million peasants against their lords between 1773 and 1774. This is the Pugachev Rebellion. The real Peter III, Catherine's husband, had preached about social reforms. And so when Pugachev comes out and preaches about social reforms and then reveals that he is Peter III, this sparks some people's imaginations and they believe, Peter III, here he is. He's been missing this whole time. In reality, we know that Peter III was dethroned by Catherine and murdered around 1762. So Catherine knew from the beginning that Pugachev was not Peter. Over the course of the Pugachev Rebellion, something like 3,000 landowners were killed. It was crushed, the rebellion was, by the Russian army. Later, serfs who had joined the rebellion were hanged by the simple method. Their bodies were hung up on metal hooks, so they were treated like livestock, essentially, which, according to the Code of 1649, they basically were. In the end, Catherine's enlightenment had its limits, right? She refused to end state censorship of printed materials. She maintained a non-merit-based nobility, the nobility of the blood, and she imprisoned those with whom she disagreed, or killed them, as she had done with the rebel serfs. When Diderot found that he was unable to change her mind on these things, he ended their friendship and told her that she did not embody Enlightenment ideals. In the end, though, to Catherine, ensuring that she retained power was much more important than embodying Enlightenment ideals. As is incredibly inevitable, when you have great powers consolidating their authority within their own state, it was pretty inevitable that conflicts between them would also emerge. Tensions between the great powers that emerged in the second half of the 18th century revealed a fundamental principle in 18th century power politics, and this is the principle of the balance of power. As the unchecked military success of any one power sought to expand territory, it inevitably brought a combined response from the other European powers. They believed strongly that they needed to maintain the balance of power in Europe for everyone's sake. Two events of the second half of the 18th century, the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, demonstrate this phenomenon of the balance of power. Let's talk about the War of Austrian Succession first. This war breaks out of sheer covetousness. Frederick the Great of Prussia wanted Silesia, which is in modern-day Poland, and if you guys look here on the map, you can find it right there. It's that in yellow part. Silesia was resource-rich, and this was primarily the reason why he wanted it. Silesia, however, was part of the Habsburg lands. In 1740, shortly after he became king, and completely without warning, he sent an army into Silesia to take it over. Frederick wanted to take advantage of the accession of a woman, Maria Theresa, to the Austrian throne. And if there was one thing that Maria Theresa actually wasn't worried about upon her accession, it was other monarchs who had agreed to the Pragmatic Sanction who would invade her territory. She thought she just had to deal with the Bohemians. So it was a huge surprise when Frederick broke the Pragmatic Sanction. But his breaking of the Pragmatic Sanction led others to do the same. The Spanish monarchy, who were upset that Maria Theresa hadn't married their heir after all, broke it. The French monarchy under Louis XV broke it because they wanted lands to the east. And the Bavarians broke it. The Bavarians had a duke who was married to Maria Theresa's cousin. This is one of the cousins who'd been shut out of the Habsburg succession. So they were all happy to get involved on Prussia's behalf. And war breaks out in Central Europe. With Prussian troops in Silesia, Maria Theresa ends up having to travel to Hungary, seeking the support of the Hungarian Diet. This diet was very conservative, and it was assumed that she was going to be unsuccessful. However, to pretty much everyone's surprise, the Hungarians agreed to send troops to support the Austrians against Prussia. Other nations who were worried about Prussian expansion, and this includes Russia, Sweden, Denmark, and Saxony, all join in the alliance against Prussia. But they're unable to defeat Prussia. So between 1740 and 1748, we have this enormous war breakout in Central Europe, and you can see all of the interested parties here. Frederick, who had just come in to take Silesia, was very satisfied with his capture of that state, and he withdraws from the war. After 1745, he and Maria Theresa agreed to the Peace of Dresden. But by that point, the British had also gotten involved because they needed to protect their dynasties, this is the Hanoverian Georges, territories, this is Hanover, from both Prussia and France. So even though Austria and Prussia kind of come to an understanding in 1745, all of their allies are still fighting it out until 1748. In 1748, the inconclusive Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ends the war. It's a war that had included territories in the American colonies. In exchange, then, for the French withdrawal from the Austrian Netherlands, the English withdrew from the fort of Louisbourg on the St. Lawrence River. The Spanish gained territories in Italy, as did the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. So territories changed hands all along the borders, basically, of Central Europe. Oh, but we were not done. In 1756, another war breaks out. This is the second major war of the 18th century, and it was remarkable in a number of ways. First, we can argue that this was the first true global conflict, as the commercial interests of Britain and France clashed in North America, in the Caribbean, and in India. Secondly, for the first time, this is a war of nation against nation, not just king against king. Both France and Britain underwent surges of patriotism where we have an understood definition of what it means to be British or what it means to be French, and fighting against those who are not British or are not French. It starts out with the diplomatic revolution. In 1756, the diplomatic revolution, which is a peace agreement and alliance, ends more than a century of intermittent warfare between France and the Austrian Habsburgs. This resolution had come about specifically because of joint French-Austrian worries about Prussian expansion. Yes, despite the fact that France supports Prussia in the War of Austrian Succession. The alliance between France and Austria later goes on to include Russia, who is also concerned with Prussian expansion. The agendas of the signatories to the diplomatic revolution were all clear. Austria wanted to reacquire Silesia. France wanted to eventually get Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands, and an Austrian promise of neutrality during the war between France and Britain. So France didn't want the Holy Roman Empire involved in a war against Britain. Prussia, concerned about the diplomatic revolution, allies with Britain. To France and Russia, this seems like a betrayal, despite the fact that, of course, France has also betrayed Prussia. So in this way, the great powers of the 18th century just change allies and go to war again. In 1757, Frederick the Great defeats a large French army and then a large Habsburg army. Later, though, a Russian army attacks him from the north and occupies Berlin, while Austrian troops march in from the south. Prussia's situation seems desperate. But then Peter III, who is briefly Tsar in Russia, calls the Russian troops home in 1762. As it turns out, Peter III was a crazy fanboy of Frederick. He admired Frederick to no end. And as he told his advisors, he could not imagine being at war with his hero. And so he recalled the Russian troops. This is the Russian troops screaming at him, but the Austrians are our allies. We need to do this for our allies. And Peter's like, but Frederick's my hero, and I'm not going to fight against him. So maybe we can understand a little bit why Catherine was so eager to take the throne from her husband. In the colonies, in India, we have a rivalry that was a struggle between the British and the French East India companies. If we look at the map here of India, what you can see is in purple, all of the areas that France controlled directly, and then in that teal color, the extent to which France had some significant control, or influence anyway, in in India. And the rest of India, of course, is taken over primarily by the British East India Company and then in contention with the French. So in India, you get the use of intrigue and warfare among the Indian rulers, which the British and the French used to their own ends. There was an invasion of Bengal, whose ruler had preferred the French, by British troops. And eventually this leads to a domination of India by the British East India Company. Since the British Navy simply prevented French traders and soldiers from receiving supplies, they blockade India. And the French, without supplies, are unable to keep fighting. In what eventually becomes Canada, British incursions into French territories led Indians to ally informally with the French. In what is referred to as the French and Indian War in the United States, British troops forced over 10,000 French-speaking Acadians, people living in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, to emigrate south. As you guys probably know by this point, they eventually settled in the French colony of New Orleans, where the word Cajun emerges as a corruption of the French Acadienne. In 1759, a British attack on the French near Quebec eventually led to the capture of Montreal and the elimination of French colonists from the Ohio Valley. So, British are successful in India, British are successful in Canada and the Americas. In the Caribbean, the British attacked and conquered many of the French islands. And keep in mind, the Caribbean was important because of sugar, tobacco, and, of course, by extension, rum. The war, by its end, 1763, had left all combatants exhausted. By the Treaty of Paris of 1763, we get new understandings, primarily border understandings, across Europe. 1. Austria recognizes that Prussia has successfully annexed Silesia. They do this in exchange for Saxony's continued independence, so Prussia will not invade Saxony. In the Americas, Canada becomes British, although the French retain fishing rights off of Newfoundland. However, the French do give up all territory to the east of the Mississippi, and specifically give up to Spain territory to the west of the Mississippi, so they're pretty much isolated now in Louisiana. In South Asia, France cedes most of its trading stations in India to Britain as well. They didn't get the supplies, they couldn't maintain their control. And in the Caribbean, France retains only the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, so they lose everything else to the British. Still, while the war had ended in 1763, enmity between Austria and Prussia did not end, and it would continue into the 19th century, despite the fact that they will work occasionally together during the French Revolution. So what we have when we look at this kind of extended war is an attempt to maintain the balance of power while at the same time extending authority and influence and, if possible, territory. The only group, the only nation, that was really able to successfully expand territory was Prussia. That, of course, was an indication of things to come.